Sometimes it takes a second to like load up.
Oh yeah, starting preview.
Yeah.
It says preview.
Check 1 2. Yeah, it might even take like a full
Okay.
3 or 4 seconds. Check 1 2. Check 1 2. So watch out of me. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming onto the live stream here. I'm here with my friend Jerry Baylor. Is that how I pronounce your last name? Jerry and I go way back. She did MoGraph Mentor a number of years ago. She's up in Tampa. Now I'm here in Sarasota. And we decided to get together here on a Saturday and get into some animation and design stuff. And so today we're going to talk about kind of the whole process, right? Starting from a piece of subject matter, going through some quick storyboarding, concept stuff, and then we want to incorporate some hand-drawn, frame-by-frame animations out of Photoshop with some different techniques in After Effects, and then also look at taking some Illustrator artwork and properly bringing that into After Effects and getting all that stuff animated. So Lindsay, if you want to go to the picture-in-picture so we can show people the monitor here. So just to give everybody the 5-minute context here, Jerry works in healthcare, so we decided that our starting point today would be healthcare related. I'm a total like policy government nerd, so we get to meet in the middle. And so we're talking a little bit about the Affordable Care Act. And one of my all-time favorite speeches from the Barack Obama is in 2009. He gives this address to Congress, and he's kind of framing the problem that, yes, costs are out of control. And he frames the solution as, he begins the speech by saying, you know, half the people in the room want us to go to single payer and dramatically simplify the way in which healthcare gets paid for. You have the libertarians in the room who'd actually like it to be more complicated than it is and actually de-link people getting their health insurance from their employer. And it would act more like car insurance where we all go as individuals and set up our own thing. But he says going either way would be too disruptive. So the Affordable Care Act, what he proposes is basically a system that looks more like what happens in Japan, which is a split between some people get it through their employer, some people get it directly through the government, some people get it through a market in which the national government creates a subsidy to help people pay for it, and it's dependent on your income. There's a whole complicated scale. So that was our starting point today. And so simplifying that out, that one of the first things I wanted to do was just go into Photoshop, start playing around a little bit on some ideas. And so the kind of main scenes that we're going to work through are some of these on the top right here, where we have the complicated version where there's tons of different private employers, private insurers in concert with the government. And then there is a far more consolidated model like Canada, where there's a national health service, or the UK, where there's just one single payer, and that's kind of the debate in the speech. This kind of pill exploding some dollar bills out because we start from this premise of costs getting really out of hand. And as I mentioned, you know, the Japanese system, I think, was a model for a lot of the Affordable Care Act. So we have this shot of just the flag of Japan. And I played around with some other just kind of quick ideas that I didn't fully execute out, but just to then bring it up to this point here, this is kind of where I landed on a first pass of some artwork. I was doing kind of like a really blocky look on the map, wanted to kind of dumb down some of the edges. And the emphasis of the shot is the complication, right? So I'm playing with kind of red, white, and blue colors against this mid-tone background. And these are kind of some of my core frames that are our starting point for some animation today. So complicated system, simple system, costs are exploding. That's the basis of our subject matter. But first, I want us to talk about creating this shot right here. And I'll go ahead and do a quick RAM preview on this guy. Because there was a reference to, he doesn't actually reference Japan in the 2009 speech, but the deeper you look into the details, it is kind of looking at the system in Japan. So I had this shot, and I wanted to do a flag animation. And Jerry and I wanted to do some actual frame-by-frame animation in Photoshop. So I thought a flag is a really good, simple place to start. We can achieve this out of just 4 poses in the flag, and it's blocky, and it's got that kind of stop-motion-y on twos feel, and if I actually just make this a little bigger, you can kind of see. So this is the first thing we're going to jump into, is working on this shot here. I'm just going to go ahead and pause that and back out. And we're going to go into Photoshop. And I'm actually going to close my storyboard up. And just before we start from scratch, I'm just going to open this existing shot and just talk a little bit about how we can go about achieving this. And as I mentioned, just 4 poses on this flag is what we're going to do. And so grouping layers and laying out a timeline is where we're going to start. So let's just go ahead and start with a totally new document. I'm going to full screen on that guy. So first thing to do, create a video timeline. If you don't have a timeline, simply go to Window, Timeline to bring that open. So you're working with a timeline here in Photoshop. The next thing I'm going to do is go take a look at timeline frame rate. By default, it's going to come in at that 2997. I prefer just to work in 24, just to keep it kind of clean. And what I'm going to do, even before we lay down any lines or anything, is actually want to bring my timeline back to the beginning here, and I'm going to create a new layer because I don't want to draw on this white layer. Everything will get kind of locked in. I'm going to create a new layer here, and let me kind of switch over to the Cintiq here. And to actually start this off, one of the first things I want to do is grab a brush. I'm just going to grab a simple brush. I need to actually select the layer. Just going to work on a 2-point brush. That's fine. And the first thing I'm going to do is give myself some guides for this flag animation. I'm going to create 3 horizontal lines just to give myself kind of a rough structure for the flag. Just going to call that some reference lines. I need to create a new layer over top of that. And now these are going to be my animation layers where we're actually going to start laying down some strokes. But before we even create our first lines, we're going to do this manually. We need to cut this up. So we're just going to do 4 poses on this flag. So I'm going to create this new layer. It should fill your entire timeline. Up here in this panel, we have this scissor icon where we can cut the layer. So I'm going to go forward to 4 frames, and I'm going to go ahead and cut that layer. Then I'm going to move to 8 and cut that layer. Then I'm going to move to 12 and cut that layer. Then I'm going to move to 16 and cut it again, and then I can delete that because we're just going to work with 4 poses and we're going to animate on 4s. I'm okay with that kind of blocky feel. So we're just going to work on 4s. And full disclosure, and this is something you should feel totally comfortable doing, is looking at reference in terms of poses. So let's see. If you just Google image, and you'll find all kinds of approaches to this. I was looking for something more simple. I think I was looking at this one where there's just 4 poses to actually look at a little reference on a flag cycle, right? If you can do it by memory, that's cool. But just looking at this flag reference, it gives you a sense of what we really need to focus on is creating that top line. And it's just kind of a sine wave, S-I-N-E, sine wave. And we just need to focus on where we are. So if you see on the first pose, the arch comes directly off that first point and then kind of dips through. Then on the second one, from that first point, we're going to dip down and put the arch in the center. And just so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and see if we can start to get some stuff down here. And I'm actually going to go up to a slightly larger brush size. And for my money, I think that is going to be pose 1, where I'm going to put down that frame. Jerry, how you doing?
I'm hanging in.
Am I moving too
Just keep going.
Okay.
I'll catch up. I'll catch up.
Okay, so the next thing to talk about is when I move forward, I no longer see that first line, and that's where onion skinning comes in. So I'm going to enable onion skin so I can see that reference. So when I'm sitting on the second pose frame, I can still see that first, I can see the previous frame. So that gives me a sense. So if I kind of look at this reference, it's, you know, the second pose almost needs to kind of dip down. I'm going to be a little rougher just to try to get it, try to get back, and then kind of more in this direction. And so the first pass can be rough, right? The first pass, I just need to do a kind of a blocking pass. And then we're definitely going to probably want to go back through and clean some of this up. So the third pose we can see is super simple, where it actually comes down and then ends up. I kind of like that stroke there. So you can see we're pretty clean on those first two. And then this one's kind of the wonkiest of all, where it kind of starts up, dips in the middle, but also ends in that fashion. That was an ugly line right there. And it doesn't have to be pretty at first. And then from here, we can start to kind of see how our blocking is doing. And I'm going to kind of keep going back to look at that reference. And from here, maybe I'll actually pull my eraser out. I'm going to turn my onion skins off, actually, and start to take another stab at getting some better looking line work in here. Kind of clean this up a little bit. And this is going to act as a guide, right? This is going to act as a reference point. And I just want my curves to look smooth enough. Now we're actually going to use this reference to actually go in and create some solid shapes. So you can kind of see we're getting the first feel of that sine wave of the top of the flag, where it's kind of cycling through. And I actually did it on 5s on my previous version, so this one's feeling even quicker, which I kind of like. Let's leave it on 4s for this version. So just to keep moving at a brisk pace here, I'm going to then grab those 4 drawings and hit Command G to group them. So that's my baseline. Then I'm going to hold Alt and drag this down. And it'll look a little wonky, but it is correct. So you can see the basis of our line. And I think I need to hit Save so it doesn't cache all that information. Try to hold it in a cache there. And sometimes I find when I group layers, I get this kind of weirdness where it shows me all the frames. But if I actually like toggle the groups open, it seems to behave a little better for whatever reason. So you can see how my kind of reference lines are helping me. I can turn those reference lines off at this point. We don't really need that. And so a much windier day here than my previous version. It's moving at a much quicker pace.
Is it possible to make a layer a smart object and scale it without losing the quality?
A Photoshop layer, a smart object. Not in Photoshop, because we're working in pixels. You're probably thinking of Adobe Illustrator, where you can scale infinitely. Now, this would actually be a good example of how you could start in Photoshop to create your reference, then take these 4 poses and go into Illustrator and create a vector-based basis of the flag. So the next thing we're going to do is create a new layer on top of this. And before I do anything, I'm going to again cut these at every 4th frame just to set myself up. And these are going to be my vertical lines. So I'm going to actually hold Shift when I draw these, and Shift again. And just go ahead and get these lines in place. Go ahead and get these lines in place. And so it's a short animation because I want to move quickly because we only have a couple hours to go through these. So you can see we're getting the basis of our flag just off of animating that top line. So the next thing I think would be cool to work on is, and I'm going to go ahead and actually group those, and I'm just going to call those my vertical lines. And the thing I love about this workflow, and I spelled it wrong, but that's fine. The thing I love about this workflow is we're just going to be able to import this Photoshop file into After Effects and still have all the flexibility to kind of break this open and do all that good stuff. So I'm going to again break these at every fourth. And there are some, I think it's called animation tools. They're like Photoshop animation tools where a lot of this stuff can be automated in terms of like breaking out the layers on 2s and 4s and all that good stuff. So one thing I want to do, actually, I'm going to create one more layer that's just a full layer, and I'm going to create a poll reference. This is not going to be my final poll, but I just want a reference layer because now on these four here. Well, actually, let's go ahead and put. One thing I want to do is go ahead and put some holes in this side of the flag. I'm going to turn my onion skins back on. And we need it to kind of feel like it's sitting in that same, distance from each corner. And it really doesn't move much on this one. Maybe it kind of pulls up to that left corner a little bit. And this one definitely moves a fair amount. I'm going to turn my onion skins back off. So now we'll get that, that kind of hole in the corner there where we're going to put our string. And I actually like how our back line doesn't stay in the same place. I've done some flags in the past where I kept these vertical lines almost too static, and it doesn't look realistic. You want that to move around a bit. So I can go ahead and group those and say those are the holes. The holes in the flag. Now I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm not going to break it into pieces because I want to do some straight ahead animation. So let's go ahead and I'm actually going to take my brush size up to 4 and do something in this realm. How we're going to get that kind of part that's almost holding it in place. And I'll try to be a little more creative. Or we can like mix it up a bit.
Where's the onion layer button?
Yeah, so it's kind of hidden in this little top right corner of your timeline. There's this drop down. There's like the 4 strokes and an arrow, and then it's right down here on Enable Onion Skins. So the reason I'm not going to break these layers out first is I don't want to have to redraw every single part of it, of the string layer. So I'm going to do a more straight ahead action here where I actually just cut the layer, go in and erase to just about there, and then kind of come in and do this number where we just change that part of the animation, right? So it's going to save myself a little work on that portion. Then we'll go forward to 8 and cut again. And it almost doesn't change the position on the holes, but just to create a little feeling of life, we'll redraw it. And I won't be able to do it exactly the same, so it'll kind of kick a little. And then this one obviously kicks up a pretty good amount. So we'll erase that back to this position where we can do this with it. And I'm just trying to get something that looks, you know, half decent. So now we've got like the basic structure of it pretty much in place. Jerry, how we looking?
I'm gonna catch up with you, Mike.
Okay. All right, so we're at this point here, and I can kind of.
What is the shortcut for cutting the layer?
So the cutting layer shortcut is the scissor icon here in the timeline panel. So you got like all your play buttons, and then there's these scissors. And so wherever your player head is located, it's going to cut the layer right there. So we can just go ahead and group those guys and say that's the string. Now we are, before we leave Photoshop here, I'm going to kind of mix up my strategy here and create some working paths here. Because I've got my rough, I've got my rough layout, but I definitely, and I need to pull open, sometimes you really gotta wrestle with these work paths. So I'm gonna grab the pen tool and create some work paths. And I need to go back, create some work paths that mirror my poses on my flag here.
Are you doing the paths on a different layer?
I'm doing the paths on a different layer, yes. Because we're going to need, although it's actually, when you first start a work path, it's actually not on any layer. We're just actually creating a work path, and that's down, you see on the bottom right-hand corner of my screen. I'm going to hold Alt to break that tangent so I can get a perfectly straight line. So now on this, I'm going to go ahead and break this up. So on this first path, well, actually I did the second frame, didn't I? Let's quickly create our 4 frames again. So this work path, and if you see on this bottom right-hand corner, I've got the paths panel open. At the very bottom of this panel, and if I have a layer selected, I'm just going to hit the fill button, and that's going to give me a totally black fill on that work path. And so now I've got that pose in there. I'm going to deselect the work path, and then just quickly do it again. And sometimes I don't pull that tangent far enough. And I really do want to try to match as close as possible, as long as I feel my initial shape is good enough. And so I'll pull Alt, hold Alt to pull that guy there, come up this direction, do this number here. And if you need more points on the path, that's fine, as long as you don't pull the tangents too far. And I'll hold Alt to break that tangent. So again, I'll just then fill on that layer, deselect that work path. So you can see how the lines we were drawing were really just to kind of get us to this point of having a really solid guide. Kind of push this in here. Hold Alt, bring that up. And this is like that moment in those cooking shows where they just cut forward, because I've already done this, so this will be the last one I do. And so again, fill. So I just wanted to show, that process of what that looks like, of, going from those kind of rough lines to doing a solid shape. And I'm not going to take the time to do the last one. So we could also group those and call those our fill. And then we could Command S. So from there, we can kind of ditch Photoshop and come into After Effects. And again, we can just go ahead and import that. And let's talk a little bit about importing. So if I were to come to flag, my flag file, by default, it's going to want to import as footage. That's not going to give us all the flexibility we need. So we can say composition, retain layer sizes. It's going to want to create a comp. Okay, that's fine. It's going to kind of ask us all again. Editable layer styles, fine, fine, okay. And then when we open this file, this is what we're going to see. Right, we've got our Photoshop layers. We've got all our various layers in here. And the first thing I'm going to do, even my guide layers, which I don't need the guide layer in there. And I actually want to go ahead and cut that down. The first thing we need to do is really create a loop out of this. So I'm going to pre-compose by hitting Shift-Command-C this flag base. And then I'm going to hit Alt-right bracket to cut that layer. So I'm really looking at the full extent. I don't need my flag reference. Well, I'll just turn my flag reference off. And those are that's my like string layer. Can cut that. And I actually don't want a background. So you can see our loop that we have going. So as you know, since we were talking about for this kind of film that we were producing, we are looking at trying to do a Japanese flag. And I wanted to try to figure out a way to achieve the red dot in the center of the Japanese flag inside of After Effects. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that could be created. So I want to add a layer style to this flag base, not satin. I want to add simply a color overlay on top of this guy. And by default, it's red, but we actually need white. The Japanese flag starts out totally white. Let's actually pull that out. So all these extra layers, right? My bottom line, my top line, my side lines, I don't need any of that. I just want to see the string layer, and I want to see the flag base. So all this other stuff can kind of go away for the moment. And I'm actually going to just remove those from the composition. And the flag, I'm actually going to remove the flag base as well, just to simplify it. So from this point, we need to go ahead and duplicate, or go ahead and pre-compose the flag base now that I have it white and the string, right? Because I only have about 24 frames of an animation in here, and we need to go ahead and loop this. So I'm going to hit Shift-Command-C and say flag base for loop, and then I'm going to hit Alt-right bracket so I'm not being deceived there. And then I could just go ahead and duplicate this out. And then I can grab both of those, duplicate it again. And then it obviously depends on how long the shot is to see how much we need. This comp is only about 5 seconds, so we only need to duplicate it out like about 6 or so times. And so we end up in this position here. So the next thing I want to do is create a new comp. And we'll just be 1920, 1080, 24 frames per second. 5 seconds is fine. I'm going to add a new solid to the background. And it can be white because I want to add a little bit of a gradient ramp. So effect, generate, gradient ramp is how we did that. And I want it to feel almost like there's light coming from a specific direction. So I'm going to move it on this kind of this diagonal axis by putting the ends of the gradient here. And so I'm going to choose a kind of light blue. I don't want it to be too green, but not totally kind of purple either. Choose a kind of light tone blue for that top left corner. We'll say that's our light source. And for this bottom left, we're going to add a little bit of a little bit of a darker blue in that direction there. So that's going to be my basis. Then if I come and actually grab my element here, I've got my flag base, and we need to scale that down. Kind of create our shot here. And then I'm going to, then I'm actually going to create, actually, I want to do it on a solid. I'm going to go ahead and create a new solid, but this time let's choose like a mid-tone on this solid. Something in kind of a middle gray so we can add a bit of shading. And in my storyboard, I had it kind of on a slight angle, and I think I'd like to repeat that again. Oops. Oh, I'm all over the map here. So I'm going to start getting this flag base, my flagpole design in here. And I need it to be relatively thin. Kind of in that territory. I can just turn my flag off. And then within this same solid, I'll just add another mask. And you can do this with shape layers. It doesn't have to be with a mask, obviously. Also, creating the artwork in Illustrator would be a good option. And I think I'm going to make that circle just a touch smaller. I'm going to duplicate that layer and then take this top layer, and I did Shift-Command-D to duplicate. Yes, ma'am?
Why use a solid versus a shape layer?
Yeah, sometimes I just like to use a solid and mask it, because then I can just kind of duplicate it. I think a shape layer is a perfectly good option too. Just a personal choice for this one. And we'll kind of pull these in this way. I'll just create kind of like a pretty hard specular highlight, and then I can just like dial in, keeping it kind of cartoony. So I can bring the flag back in and then start to get a sense of the size. Maybe do a little rotation. It needs to sit above the pole, but the way we drew our string, we should be able to kind of create this effect. You know, now we're getting into this territory. So the next thing I want to do is grab my flag, and I'm going to hit Command-D, and I'm going to turn it into a 3D layer. I'm going to rotate it on the x-axis 90 degrees, and I want to create a bit of a shadow here on the ground. And we need to flatten this out because the shadow would fall flat. I'll kind of find where I think our ground plane is, pull it out. And the shadow is going to be thin, so I'm just going to pinch the scale in this direction here. And then I'm going to grab the whole layer, undo a layer style, and do a color overlay. And this, I think, would be an opportunity to play with it. Like, we could play with red shadows. I think that could be interesting. Or we can just toggle this down, go to our color overlay, and just take it purely to black. Right, and then maybe dial in that opacity, something like 50%, 30%. Now you're just getting into some design aesthetic in terms of dialing it in of where you think it ought to be. But because that has some animation on it, you will get like that little bit of body and motion to that, just to try to keep. And this time I will use a shape layer as opposed to a solid. Let's go ahead and give ourselves a contact shadow underneath our pole layer. That's going to need to be under the pole, obviously. And it wouldn't be pure black, so again, I think kind of opacity, dial that in. Looks like maybe my flag needs to come forward in the y-axis to kind of match a little bit more. And the string's not totally realistic, but it's so small. I think that we'll probably get away with that. So as I was saying, we did it really, really simply in terms of what we were going to draw in Photoshop. But now we need to come back into this flag base and actually go all the way into our base loop. And we need to get the final design of the Japanese flag in place. So let's go ahead and grab a shape layer. We're going to make it red. If you want to be super official, go find the Japanese flag and actually create the exact color it would be. I'm just going to kind of eyeball a red color. And so I think this frame is a good frame for us to create as a starting point. And I'm going to cut that layer. So we need to, I want to work with a Bezier warp on this to kind of beat up this red dot to make it look like it's really a part of the flag. So first we need to pre-compose the shape layer. And we'll say red dot, move all attributes, fine. So one kind of quirk of the Bezier warp is the layer size matters, because the Bezier warp is going to hug the very edge of the layer itself. So I'm going to go into this red dot, and I'm going to hit Command K, because the layer is just too big. I don't want it to be the exact size of the dot, but I want it to be roughly the size of the flag, let's say. So maybe even a little more width. Pull this down. Let's go back and see how that looks. So this is much closer. If you can kind of see the edges of my pre-comped layer for the red dot, I'm actually going to hit Command K and add a bit more width, because I want it to be kind of close to the size of the flag. So we can add maybe even another 100 pixels, and it doesn't have to be exact, but just kind of roughly that size. So we'll go into Effect, we'll go into our Distort tools, and let's see, Distort, where are you at? Bezier Warp, not Displacement Map. Very top, I'm a dummy. Bezier Warp. So the Bezier Warp tool is really useful for this. So let's just take a look at what it does, right? I can start to pull on these corners, and it's going to it's going to affect what's in the middle there. So let's start by creating a pose on this very first one. I think, if this was really a flag, we would never see it exactly perfect. So it needs to be just like a little oblong, or like a little bit off for each frame. So let's say that looks about okay. And again, we just have 4 poses, so that makes it easy. I'll go to our very second pose, and I'm just going to actually lay a keyframe for all of the various vertexes and tangents, just in case. Then I'll go backwards 1 and say, now it should be pulling up to the right more in this direction. So we can kind of pull it up there. And again, we're just kind of eyeballing what we think looks good. And you can kind of play it back and forth, see how it's looking. So now one thing we need to remember is we want to lay down keyframes before we go to the next pose, right? So now here's the next pose. So it should probably pull down slightly in this direction. Maybe it kind of pulls out this way even a little bit more, kind of pulls towards that corner. So we're getting into this feel right here, and then one more pose. So
let me ask you something.
Yeah.
So why did we just do the Bezier warp on the red dot as opposed to pre-composing the base and the dot so that they move together?
Well, the base already moves.
So because we did that in Photoshop.
Because we did that in Photoshop. Now, I think you could do the whole flag animation in After Effects. I think we could have just tried to procedurally do that. I think it was. I just enjoy trying to do stuff in the Photoshop timeline when I can. But we did need to pre-compose the shape layer to be able to
Warped it.
to add this warp effect to it. So you can kind of like pull the Bezier warp off and see how we're doing. I think it's up to opinion if we're close or not. So let's go ahead and do a quick. Maybe that third pose is pulling a little bit. So yeah, this is, one of the things I wanted us to get into today was just combining 2D animation with a solution of shape layers and shapes in a program like After Effects. Just because in my experience, this is how most stuff gets produced, just like finding whether it's out of Cinema 4D, like that'd have been a whole nother route to go down for our flag, right? We could have just easily created that in Cinema 4D and used the flag tool set. But I think it's also cool that you'll just get a slightly different aesthetic and you'll get a slightly different look. So because we put all this information in the base loop, we can go back to our main comp here. And it's just inside that nested comp, right? So it loops seamlessly for us. So what were comp 2 here? Yeah, this is where we were. And so there we have it, right? Kind of first draft of this shot. I think we could push the pole further. Well, I don't have it perfectly looped at the end there, so it kind of hiccups a little bit. So there we have it. Any questions, Lindsay? We good? Good on the chat stream. So the next thing we'll look at is bringing in some of our existing Illustrator artwork. And let's go ahead and load up a shot and talk about kind of diving into one of these shots. Let's start with the ACA short version 101, just this very first shot. And again, we get this same exact issue of it wants to import as footage, which is not what we want. We want composition, retain layer sizes. Go ahead and hit open, and it's gonna create a composition for us. Now, one thing to note about getting out of Illustrator, the way that I like to work is I'll design my boards all in one single comp. Then when you save, there's a dialog to save each artboard to its own file. Then I'll individually go into each file and make sure that I'm breaking everything out into its own layers. And I do some minimal naming. I'll name the background layer. I'll name my big objects. But if I have a ton of repetitive objects, like all these red strokes, I'll typically just name the first stroke and the last stroke so that when I go into After Effects, I can see generally like where all my stroked layers are, and then I'll just change the color. And since they're red, let's actually make them red. These are all my, I can just name the first building and the last building. So like those are all those layers. That was actually an empty layer. The white map, gray background, all that good stuff. So one of the first things we want to do here is get these objects into a more editable fashion. Like we can't do much with these strokes the way they are. So if we actually say, select all our strokes, control click on one of the layers, create shapes from vector layer. It's going to create a duplicate and give us an actual shape layer on all those. And then I'm just going to actually grab those and move them up so they're there. We can take all of these and try to create, turning them into shy layers. And then we can actually take advantage of this hide shy layers dialog, this switch here, which I really like, right? Because it's like, those are duplicates. Maybe we don't want to delete them, but we don't actually need to be seeing them. So right off the bat, I think we're faced with, the stroked lines are obviously the core of this shot. And we need to, I think we need to find a good solution to what we're going to do with these. So I'm actually going to solo them, turn everything else off, and so we can just really focus on what's going on here. Because there's so many, I definitely think we should find some kind of solution that works for one that can be applied to the rest. And so I think it's definitely going to be in the realm of trim path here. So let's create a trim path. Let's get in here. Now, if the stroke is at a full 100%, it's going to be hard to get any animation out of it. So I think, let's try like 70% of the line. Pull that line back, and you can actually hide toggle, shape path visibility. I'm going to turn that off so we can kind of take a look at the offset here. So that gives me a sense of like, and just however much we pull the end point back. So if we took it to like 80%, that gap would close. If we took it to 90%, that gap would close even further. And so I think it's a matter of just like what works for the shot. I think maybe something in the realm of 80% I think is good. We'll be able to show that kind of flow. So rather than actually keyframing all this, let's alt-click on the stopwatch of offset. And I'm going to say time times, so like Shift-8, the times icon, time times 100. And let's, I'm going to hit N to close this down to a second. So way too slow. Time times 1,000. And maybe too fast. But typically going with like a multiple of 100 or 1,000 gives me like a good sense of the general speed. Maybe we need to like look at 2 seconds. So that pace feels a little bit better. So now that we have this this trim path set up like we do, we can say Command C, and actually want to make sure I select everything in the trim path. Hit Command C.
So, Michael, let me just ask you a quick question before we copy the expression to. So the expression is trimming the path as opposed to us adding the anchor, adding the what do you call them? Adding the keyframes. Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you mean putting this expression into the offset?
Yeah, as
Yeah.
opposed to.
So
Not
like,
everybody's going to know that, and
sure.
I typically will keyframe them.
Yeah, to keyframe the offset.
Yeah, so that I could add some smoothness to the movement through the graph editor.
Yeah. I mean, for this shot,
looks pretty cool.
I just want to show this general motion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's looking a little, and maybe we need to unsolo it and see how it looks with the rest of our artwork. The long lines look better.
Then the shorter ones.
Some of the shorter lines, maybe we need to go ahead and pull. So let's like take an example. Like this is one of the shorter lines. I'll hit U twice.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe instead of 80%, it's more like 50%.
Okay.
So we'll like widen that gap.
Mm-hmm.
Because I guess that's the problem with our small lines. If we're only cutting 20% out, it's so tiny, it doesn't quite look right. So we can, use the U key twice, pull that back to 50%. You can just click directly on the layer in the viewfinder. And so I think a little bit of cleanup on a shot like this is certainly to be expected. Hit U twice. Nope, already did that one. So like this guy. But because there's so many duplicate layers, I think a kind of procedural solution is definitely the way to go. I'm like, oh, that line looks terrible. Select it, hit U twice. See that line, this line is so short that might need to be like 30%, just so we can see the motion a little bit better. And then it's just kind of like, all right, what are the problem areas? Okay, this one's a problem area. Let's take that down to 50% and see. Because the purpose, the emphasis of the shot is the chaos, is the complexity, is these, million moving parts type of idea.
Mm-hmm.
So if I unsolo these, let's come back into our world here and kind of see where we're at. All right, so we're getting kind of that general vibe of all this movement. let's take all these lines. I actually want them on the very top of the composition. Now, in terms of a transition, though, if we're just if we want to bring them on for a first time, we are going to have to do some keyframing here. So let's see.
Would pre-composing them make them easier to work with as opposed to them laying on top?
I think for now, let's leave them in kind of a live capacity. But let's actually just go ahead and turn them off. Let's take a look at these buildings here. So for the buildings, let's do like a scale animation. Let's scale them in. But I'm first gonna move the anchor points to the bottom.
Okay.
So I'm gonna hit A to pull up anchor points. I'm gonna grab that second value and pull them up. But then I need to like move them back to where they were in the scene by hitting position.
Holy cannolis.
And then moving them back to where they were positionally. And you can kind of see where I'm going with it. It's like, Dallas, Miami, like just kind of generally putting the cities where they are, but we're keeping it blocky, we're keeping it playful. So they don't need to be perfect. And let's go ahead and hit S to bring up scale. And I'd say at about not quite let's say almost a full second, they kind of hit like 110%, because I think we should do a little bit of overlap. And we can also continually rasterize these since it's Illustrator artwork, so that we don't lose any resolution. And then a little bit after a second, they'll all fall back to 100%. And then so at the very beginning, they'll all be at 0. So now we've got keyframes on all of these. I'm going to select all of them, give us a keyframe assist easy ease, just so we have a starting point. And so sometimes when you open this, you'll open in the speed graph, and you're going to get this look. We want to work in the value graph, right? We want to work with these actual values. And I'm going to select all of our kind of top points. And I'm going to hit this convert selected to auto Bezier, because by default, if I don't do that and I just start kind of doing this, the tangent is broken. And I don't totally understand why that would be the default versus keeping them on a Bezier where we can kind of get this action, which feels way more logical. But I don't know that we want them to ease out so slowly. I think we want them to kind of pop out, go to 110 or so %, and then go back to their resting place here. So I'm going to move this out a little bit, and we'll kind of ease them in. And I'm actually going to grab these front two and condense this so their middle point is a little quicker. I think that was a little slow on my first blocking there. And we'll go ahead and tighten this up, this timing as well. And for me, the thing to do is always then just quickly take a look. And it feels pretty lethargic, if you ask me. So let's go ahead and tighten this up. They're really going to need to pop out of there in even less than half a second. And the back end of this timing, we can tighten up as well. And go ahead and push that. Sometimes we need to take a look. Still feels even a touch lethargic to me. So my favorite thing about the value graph and the graph editor generally is being able to change the timing with this bounding box. And if you're not seeing that, or if you're not getting that, there is an icon to turn the transform box on and off when you have multiple keyframes selected, right? So if you're selecting all the keyframes and you're not seeing it, make sure that you're asking for that bounding box. So we're getting a little better. I think that's probably going to be okay. Now I'm going to go in here and just kind of randomize. And there's scripts to do this kind of thing, but just to do out-of-the-box tools, So we'll get kind of that motion there, where they kind of come in and do their thing. We'll move these forward just a little bit, move our lines forward just a little bit. And I'm going to turn all those off. Let's focus now on kind of bringing in the map element in kind of a transition here. So let's see. A couple of ways we could go about this, right? I think, my first thought always goes to maybe the previous scene, we have this white background, so it could be kind of a zoom out and everything comes into focus. We could do a masking animation, like maybe the camera move was more left to right and we're going to mask them on. Maybe we're kind of pulling up from kind of screen bottom. But let's go with kind of a masking animation for this. So I'm just going to grab the top layer, and I'm going to grab my pen tool, and I'm going to create a diagonal, kind of a mask that gives me a single diagonal edge. And because we have two layers, maybe we can get something nice going here. So we need to actually animate on the mask path. So our final point is going to be right there. And our starting point is going to be this back left corner. And I always want to get them absolutely as close as possible to the artwork so that when we do our easing, we can take full advantage. So we'll just come into the speed graph since we're working with masks and there's no real values. And let's take a look. I think it feels pretty good and snappy. Maybe we push that even a little bit more. And one thing I like to do is create even a little more complexity by duplicating this mask, and we'll offset the top one. I'm going to turn off that blue background. Let's just work with the white one. So I've duplicated the white map. So I have two versions. I'm going to go in here and a simple choker on this top layer and go ahead and pull this. Oops. Oh, I need to unselect this back layer. Oops. Or do I want a, do I want a matte choker? No, I do want a simple choker. What's going on here? Effect, matte, simple choke. Yeah, now it's working. It's just, I just was looking at my layer twice. So I'm going to do a color overlay so we can see this a little better. This is not going to be our final color. And I've got that. Kind of confusing myself here, sorry. Oh, I see. Doing it backwards. So let's work with this simple choker here, where you can really choke down the edges of this bottom layer, just so that we add a little bit more of a custom shape, and maybe they don't need to be so far apart on their timing. Maybe even just a single frame or two. So yeah, this is what I intended to do here. So instead of doing such a stark red color, let's see if we can do something a little more subtle on that layer style. And just choose a mid-tone kind of gray color. And it's going to be super, super subtle if it's that quick. And if we want to see it a little bit more, we would need to move this off in this direction, move that top layer to be offset a little bit more. So very snappy, we're moving very quickly. Let's do this blue background now. So if I actually just copy and paste that mask, because the shape is almost identical, it's going to be pretty close to what we need. So we start getting something in that general vicinity, and can turn all of our red lines back on. And start to see how this shot's going to develop. So I turned all my buildings off. I'm going to select all those buildings, turn them back on, and now we start kind of getting into a question of general timing for the shot. And I can see some of my buildings are popping up even before those base layers are done. So I'm going to grab everything that's up top and kind of move it, inch it back ever so slightly. And I think for the red lines, I'm actually okay with them kind of popping on like they do, but I just want to actually randomize it just a touch. Just so it feels a little broken up. So we're getting the first kind of pieces of a rough draft here on this shot, where we're getting this kind of complexity going. So I have this, let's take a look, let's see what we can do with this background texture layer. So I had a background texture where I'm using all of these kind of zigzagged rounded lines, and I think it'd be cool to get a little motion going in there. And the actual shape layer it's going to create, because I kept all that on a single layer, is just a boatload of groups. The good news is we can add a single trim path. Actually, don't want to do that. We should be able to add a single trim path to the very end, and as long as it's on the bottom, it's going to affect all of those. So if we take that to like 60%, and go ahead and do an offset, we can get kind of an animated background going. So again, I'm going to say time times, let's say 300, and we'll get this kind of animated background going here. And stylistically, they're sticking out way too much. In my design, I had them blended way, way, way down. Something close to 10%, just an element you kind of feel in the scene. It shouldn't really be like an emphasis or a focus. So we start to get something in there. All right, how we doing?
I'm good. You lost me at the textures, though. Oh, I found them.
The background texture?
Yeah.
Yeah, that very bottom layer. How we doing, Lindsay? Good. Very, very good. So I'd say let's go ahead and import the second shot, and this will be actually let's actually skip to the third shot. This will be the last thing we do. Another 20-30 minutes here, and we'll wrap it up.
Awesome.
So let's move to that third shot where there's like the pill scene and all these dollar bills where we're talking about cost. And again, composition, retain layer sizes, super important to get that in that way. We've got all these accent layers, which again, on my naming schemes, I'll typically just name the first and the last, so I can come in and use my color labels to get that kind of thing. Again, all these dollar bills, I think we're going to have some fun there. We've got to choose green, right? Because we're talking about money there. These are our two biggest elements, these pills. So the accent layers, let's dollar, textured background, blue background, that's all fine. I'm just going to turn that off. So we need to create a little bit of almost like a rig. And I think first of all, I'm going to take all my accent layers. Well, first I'm going to create a null object that I'm going to put at basically the breakpoint of the pill. And the white pill, the red pill, and I'm going to actually put the null object under the pills. And the accent layers, I'm going to link to this null object. Now the red pill and the white pill, let's start just by focusing on this break animation. So if this is our final pose, like if this is our approved pose after they break, I'm going to hit position, lay down some position keyframes, and then go backwards in time a little bit. And I'm going to create a single guide layer. Actually, we also need to lay down some rotation keyframes as well. So position and rotation, go backwards in time, and move these forward. Make sure I hug that guideline. I'm going to pull it up, come to the red pill, do position and rotation as well. And I think these axis points are going to be just fine. And another guide layer to do would be this top one, wouldn't it? And we'll just go ahead and hug these into place. Take the red pill. So we get that kind of starting point where they're together. And the reason I wanted to put everything on a null object is it's easy to imagine in the shot, needing the pill to kind of come in or move in space and do something and then get to the break animation. So getting it on a null object is a good way just to keep its overall position in the frame flexible. Now the animation doesn't look like much of a break because we have this linear spacing and linear spacing on it. Let's just take a look at the timing. So I'm going to go ahead and come in here, ease. We know we want it to like break instantly and then kind of ease into their final poses. And even getting some overlapping action, I think, is probably something we should consider. So I'm even going to move forward a little bit, add some more rotation and position frames, and then come in here and like exaggerate the position and the rotation a little bit before we get to that final pose. Exaggerate the position and the rotation. So we'll go out and then kind of back in slightly. So first, if we just focus on the position, let's see if we can't do everything in the speed graph. We looked at the value graph. Let's take a look at doing it in the position graph, or in the speed graph, excuse me. So we know we want it to be fast out, so I'm going to pull this direction, where that speed's going to be fast out. Pull it out here. It can kind of ease. And what's going to be a little tricky is we don't totally want it to stop on that overshoot. We want it to feel kind of smooth out into that overshoot. So we want to actually pull these middle frames up off of 0 on velocity, right? Because in the velocity graph, we're actually giving it kind of a general speed. It can almost kind of ease through the middle there. So we're going to get a little wonky on that. Now it's still not feeling quite right because our rotation, and actually we'll use the value graph on the rotation, and let's just take it one at a time. On rotation here, we want it to feel like it breaks quickly. Change that to auto Bezier. And then kind of ease into place. So it's actually making the rotation really quick is probably the most important part of like selling this break feel. So let's come into this guy, add a little bit of rotation velocity there, turn this to auto Bezier. I probably can change that in my preferences to default to that. And then kind of ease into that final rotation. We can see our position's a little wonky. So we come back into this speed graph. So I think that's a starting point. I'd say the next thing we would want to focus on is the kind of dollar bills shooting out in every direction. So I'm going to turn off all these accent layers, which we can come to. But actually animating all of these is going to be fun because there's no real kind of procedural way to go about this. So if this is like our general art direction, and it feels like they need to be more up here. Turn off those guides. If this is the general art direction of where they end, we can kind of come forward. And we don't want to actually see them until that first break frame. So I'm going to move everything forward in time. And we can kind of see how we can start to block generally the overall timing just by moving that layer forward. But of course, we don't want them to just pop on. We want them to actually shoot out and give us something to animate. So I'm going to move forward in time a bit, hit P on position, lay down some keyframes, then go backwards and actually come into the composition and just start pulling these in just by going into, and I should go ahead and lock down my pill and my null so I don't accidentally grab those. Grab all of these, pull them into place, and we'll start to get this effect here. And I'll really try to like move everything to a center position. So we'll get that initial blocking going. I think the other thing we could do is grab all of our dollars, go forward just a couple frames, hit S for scale, set a frame at 100, go back to that initial break and hit 0. And then let's take a look at that in the graph editor. So I'm going to grab all those scale keyframes, give myself an easy ease, and I just want it to ease into that. I do want it to pop up pretty quickly, but I think just making them effectively invisible will be a good place to start. Now, the real challenge here is to actually work with the position frames here and go into the graph editor. And before I do that, actually come in and say, give me some easing on these. And we're looking in the speed graph, but we didn't separate dimensions, so we actually are going to need to keep it in the speed graph, which is okay. So we want it to explode out, meaning, right, we want to pull that all the way this direction and say like ease into those frames. We want you to pop out pretty quickly. And so we'll start to get like an early look at what that might look like. So the biggest problem so far is that all the ones in the middle stay kind of too static. So I'm actually going to come in here and make sure at least they move a little bit. I don't want the whole thing feeling too static. And these, I think, maybe they need to just reach even further. Even further out. And then just for aesthetics' sake, kind of like a little better spacing. So we've got a pretty good start on blocking, I think. Some of those, I'm getting a little bogged down because I'm running a lot of software here. Some of those are a little lethargic because I had done my easing before I set some of that movement. So just kind of redoing this movement here, where I really want the initial motion to pop out. The other thing we could do just to add a little bit more life into that explosion is add a little bit of rotation. So we can go set an end keyframe and then maybe pull each one back. Pull each one back maybe like negative 30 degrees. So we feel a little bit of that rotation. But again, we would need to, I'm going to hit so I can see everything here. Easy ease. And we want the rotation to ease out in a similar fashion. And, you know, for me, it's like when you're first designing a frame like this, it's easy to think like, oh gosh, how am I going to animate all these pieces? But I feel like After Effects, especially with each version, it's just gotten a little easier and a little easier to manage stuff like this. So let's see. Last thing I think we'll do here is let's create a little bit of a kind of move in on this, just to talk a little bit about what that might look like. So all these dollars, I'm also going to link to this null object, even though we don't see them. I just want to make sure. That we have them in place. So for this first second here, I'm going to set a position keyframe on the null, then kind of come forward, and let's just have it basically descend down. And we'll just set a little bit of a move. Just to give ourselves a little bit more of a challenge in terms of kind of animating in and out.
That's kind of cool.
And obviously we're just kind of like looking at potentially how to do some of these shots. If we were going to have to make the whole film, it's like the question of flowing from each shot to the next, obviously, of how you're going to go about that. And, you know, the next shot always informing. I think I'm running out of cache space here, so it's choking up a little bit. Okay, we've been going hour and a half here, probably ready for a break. How's everybody doing on the live stream? We have any Anybody sticking with us this long? Okay. Good stuff, good stuff. So I think I'm going to post these scene files up after we're done here. So people, if you want to take these, play with them, tear it apart, animate it yourself, just to practice, that's something we definitely want to encourage. Go ahead.
There were just a few questions just about the location. I guess people wanted to know.
What do you mean location?
One person said the lighting looked really nice.
Oh, good.
They were asking if this was like your new location.
This is our new location. We're in Sarasota, Florida. That's why me and Jerry get to hang out. She's up in Tampa. We're no longer in Oregon. I'm here in Florida. We're launching a first physical campus that's called Create Academy. A lot more to come on that front. But we're launching a campus with seats for 20 to 25 students who want to work on the same stuff, right? They want to work in advertising, communications, entertainment. So that's why we're setting up this campus, is to try to serve people in the digital arts and communication, and even a little entrepreneurship, which is just selfish for me, because that's the stuff I like to geek out on. So we're going to try to gear up for a good fall and find the animators, designers, the young people that are into that stuff, or people of all ages, really, that are having to switch careers. We're having to remake ourselves every 5 or 10 years because the economy is just moving so quickly. But these are really great skill sets to have. You know, I think maybe Jerry can even speak to it a little. Of you're doing design and animation stuff for United Healthcare, is the company?
Yeah.
And you can work remote. You can work from anywhere in the country. That's
Anywhere in the
fantastic.
country. Yeah, and you know, I can just attest to the growth and development that I personally have had from MoGraph Mentor and the mentorships and the training that I've gotten through Michael's endeavors. So I'll follow him anywhere.
I'm glad to hear it, yes. We made her say that, yes.
No, he didn't, but I will. He just doesn't know that yet.
Yeah. So, you know, if there's any final questions, we can hang out for a second here. But thank you all for tuning in. Hopefully some good tidbits on just, you know, I love to see people taking elements out of Photoshop. You know, it's such a great tool set to be able to quickly, you know, come up with different animations in 2D, pull that stuff into After Effects, pull artwork out of Illustrator, quickly create stuff. You know, I put all of this together. I didn't have a ton of time to plan for this, so maybe like 3 or 4 hours this week putting this stuff together. But just touching on some of the workflow stuff that I think is helpful. Yes, ma'am.
One person asked how they could join the facilities.
Yeah, come on in. Go to createacademy.io, fill out the application if you want to apply for a seat, or come by and see us at 1421 5th Street here in Sarasota. Are you in Sarasota? Person who is asking. See if they give us a response. We are going to do some online stuff through the new brand, through Create Academy. So that stuff is probably more like the beginning of next year. My main priority here is the physical seats and then continuing MoGraph Mentor. So if you're within a driving distance, come on out, and we'd love to talk to you. No response. That's okay. Okay, we're going to sign off there. Jerry, thank you so much for making the drive down to hang out and geek out on a little bit of this stuff.
This is awesome.
Maybe we'll go get some beer or food after this to hang out a little bit. But thanks to everybody on the live stream. Lindsay, you can hit the live button to kill us. We will see you next time. And thanks for hanging out, everybody.